August 8, 1944. Near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramasnil, south of Caen, the fields of Normandy shimmered beneath a pale morning haze. Captain Michael Wittmann, legend of the Panzerwaffe, tightened his black leather gloves and peered through his Zeiss binoculars. His Tiger Gur, number 007, stood like a steel cathedral amid the orchards. Around him, 3 other Tigers waited, engines rumbling like restrained beasts. For 3 hours, they had turned the battlefield into a graveyard of Shermans, 27 burning carcasses scattered along the Conflans road. To any observer, the Tiger had proven immortal. Its 88mm gun tore through Allied armor like paper. Its armor plates shrugged off incoming fire with contempt. Every German tanker believed it. The Tiger was invincible. But as Wittmann lowered his binoculars, his hands began to tremble. Not from fear, but from realization. Beyond the smoke and flame, through the hedgerows, he saw more shapes moving, dozens of them. Shermans, 40, maybe 50. Fresh paint, fresh crews, full fuel tanks. Behind them, clouds of dust marked another wave. His radio crackled with static and disbelief. 4 Tigers remained, 12 armor-piercing rounds between them. No reserves, no fuel to retreat. And still, the Americans kept coming. Wittmann whispered, "They never stop." That morning, in the wheat fields of Normandy, the legend of the Tiger met the arithmetic of America. Within minutes, the gun that symbolized German genius would fall silent. Historians still debate who fired the fatal shot, a British Firefly or a Canadian Sherman, but Wittmann's last words over the radio were clear. Ammunition exhausted, enemy unlimited. It was not just the death of a tank commander, it was the moment Germany's faith in perfection died. 2 years earlier, at Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, the Tiger had been born in a blaze of arrogance and awe. Ferdinand Porsche and Henschel engineers presented their prototypes before the Führer. The massive 88mm cannon, the interleaved wheels, the armor thicker than any Allied gun could pierce, it was engineering poetry. Hitler's eyes gleamed. "One Tiger," he declared, "is worth 12 of theirs." His generals nodded. It was a seductive idea. Quality over quantity, genius over numbers. The order went out, build the Tiger no matter the cost. It would be the sword of German superiority, handcrafted by master machinists. Each component measured to perfection, each weld inspected thrice. The result was magnificent and disastrous. It took 300,000 man-hours to build a single Tiger, 26,000 parts. Precision that demanded artisans, not laborers. Germany imagined this obsession as strength, but it was a chain. Across the Atlantic, a very different conversation took place in a smoke-filled White House office. May the 28th, 1940. President Roosevelt called William Knudsen, former head of General Motors. "Bill," he said, "we need 50,000 planes and 50,000 tanks." Knudsen didn't hesitate. "Mr. President, we can't build the best tanks, but we can build the most. And we'll build them so any kid from Iowa can fix them with a wrench." Out of that promise came the M4 Sherman, the so-called tin can. It lacked glamour, its armor was thin, its gun was modest, but it was simple, reliable, and infinitely reproducible. Detroit didn't build masterpieces, it built miracles of logistics. At Henschel's Kassel factory in Kassel, 9,000 skilled craftsmen assembled Tigers by hand. They took pride in every bolt. "We spent 3 days just on the final drive assembly," one worker recalled. "Each gear checked with micrometers. Each weld polished. It wasn't mass production, it was art." Meanwhile, in Michigan, the Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal looked like a living organism of steel and sparks. Housewives, teenagers, and mechanics turned the car skills into war production. Tanks rolled off the line every 4 hours. "They gave us 2 days of training," said Rosie the Riveter. "Then they handed us welding guns. One seam, one step, one tank at a time. The Tiger required a month to build. The Sherman needed 2 days. The numbers began to tell a story the battlefield would soon echo. By December 1942, America was producing 3,500 Shermans a month across 11 factories. Germany built 34 Tigers. The ratio, 103 to 1, wasn't just a statistic, it was prophecy. When Allied tanks burned, replacements arrived from British depots within 48 hours. When a Tiger burned, it vanished forever. Every loss for Germany was a scar. Every loss for America was an inconvenience. Still, on the battlefield, Tigers seemed godlike. In one duel, a single Tiger destroyed 14 Allied vehicles in 15 minutes. Propaganda called it proof of Aryan superiority. What they didn't print was what happened next. Within 3 days, every British tank was replaced. The Tiger Company, missing 3 of its own, would wait 6 weeks for new ones. A British officer later summarized it perfectly. Wittmann was brilliant, no doubt. But brilliance is exhaustible. Industrial production is not. The war had shifted from tactics to tonnage, from gun barrels to assembly lines. A Tiger could win duels, but Detroit could win decades. The math was merciless. By mid-1944, Germany's fuel reserves were bleeding dry. Tigers consumed 5 gallons per mile. Their engines demanded high-octane fuel that Germany could barely produce. Many Tigers never reached the front. Others were abandoned, immobile, their majestic engines coughing in silence. Meanwhile, Shermans drank regular gasoline, anything flammable, really, and America had oceans of it. A Tiger battalion moving 100 miles needed 40,000 gallons of fuel. A Sherman company needed 3,000. Germany's perfection devoured its future. When Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, his commanders knew the truth. They weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting mathematics. By the summer of 1944, the Western Front had become an assembly line of destruction. For every Tiger that roared into battle, 10 Shermans waited beyond the hedgerows. It was not just a contest of tanks, it was a contest of systems, of philosophies born in 2 different worlds. Germany built warriors. America built replacements. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, hundreds of Shermans sat in long rows under the sun. They were not for combat, but for training. Recruits climbed into them, broke them, fixed them, drove them again. A young private named Clarence Smoyer remembered, "We beat those training tanks to death. Then we rebuilt them. By the time we shipped out, I knew every sound that engine made." Each American crew spent 12 weeks mastering every screw and lever. By the time they reached France, they could swap an engine blindfolded. In Germany, things were different. The Panzer Truppenschule had only 4 Tiger tanks for all of its training. Crews spent most of their lessons inside wooden mock-ups or studying diagrams. Some soldiers saw their real Tiger only days before being sent to the front. One gunner recalled, "When our Tiger arrived in Russia, half the crew had never even started the Maybach engine." The Tiger was not just complex, it was cruel to maintain. Its overlapping wheels, a marvel of engineering, required removing up to 9 wheels to replace a single inner one, a task that might take 12 hours, even in peace. Its gearbox demanded specialized tools that only a few depots possessed. Field repairs were nightmares. When a transmission failed, the entire turret had to be lifted by a 15-ton crane. Equipment the front lines rarely had. By contrast, the Sherman was built for the field. Its design invited rough hands and improvisation. Every part was accessible. Mechanics could replace a transmission in 4 hours. A complete engine swap took 6. It was like fixing a farm tractor, said Sergeant Robert Early. Any kid who worked on a John Deere could fix a Sherman. When something broke, crews unbolted it, grabbed a spare from the depot, and were back in action before nightfall. This difference, art versus utility, spread far beyond the workshops. It seeped into the minds of the men who fought inside those steel beasts. Tiger crews were elite, hand-picked, proud. They believed they commanded the best machine ever built, and in many ways they were right. The 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. Allied shells often bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's armor. Each Tiger felt like a fortress, a cathedral of war. But with that superiority came unbearable pressure. Every Tiger was irreplaceable. Every loss was a national failure. Sergeant Carl Brauman, a Tiger gunner, wrote later, "We were not soldiers anymore. We were accountants. We had to kill 10, 20, 30 tanks to justify our existence." On the Allied side, the psychology was almost the opposite. Sherman crews knew their tanks were vulnerable. They joked bitterly about it. The Tommy cooker, the Germans called it, because a Sherman hit by an 88 often burst into flame. Yet the Americans fought with an odd confidence, not because they felt invincible, but because they knew they were replaceable. Sergeant Joe Saunders explained it simply. If our tank got hit, we'd bail out, walk back, get another one, and return to fight. The Germans couldn't do that. They lost a Tiger, they lost months of training and the men who knew it. We lost a Sherman, we lost some metal. The Tiger's excellence became its curse. It devoured time, fuel, manpower, and lives. Training a single Tiger crew properly required 19 man-months, almost 2 years of collective effort. Training a Sherman crew took 5. Germany could never afford that equation. By mid-1944, Fort Knox was graduating 2,000 Sherman crews each month. In England, 10,000 trained replacements waited in reserve. When a loader or gunner was lost in Normandy, a new one stepped in within hours, trained on the exact same machine. Standardization was America's secret weapon. Every Sherman was the same. Every part, every switch, every round fit perfectly in every tank. The Tiger had no such luxury. Its components were unique, its tolerances microscopic. If a transmission came from another factory, it might not fit. If a road wheel cracked, a mechanic might have to hand-file a replacement. Perfection was beautiful, but perfection does not forgive war. On June 6th, D-Day, 4,000 Allied tanks landed in France. 8,000 more waited in Britain. Against them, Germany had 1,347 Tigers ever built, of which barely 430 were operational on all fronts. In Normandy, there were just 102. Numbers do not fight wars by themselves, but they do decide how long one can be fought. A Tiger burned for glory. A Sherman burned for strategy. The difference was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. One commander in the British 7th Armored Division described it best. A Tiger could kill us faster than we could brew tea, but we could replace our tanks faster than they could reload. By August 1944, that statement was no longer metaphor. It was battlefield reality. The Germans fought with masterpieces. The Americans fought with math. Each Sherman was a line in an equation of inevitability, an equation written not in the mud of Normandy, but in the assembly lines of Detroit. While German tankers dreamed of precision, American workers dreamed of quantity. Every woman with a welding torch, every teenager in overalls, every factory foreman counted not kills, but output. Above the production floor of the Detroit Arsenal hung a banner that said, "Every tank we build is a life saved." And it was true. Each Sherman meant one more chance for a crew to survive, one more opportunity to keep moving forward, one more line in the arithmetic of victory. The Tiger might have been immortal in theory, but in the mathematics of modern war, even immortality could be buried under 49,000 American tin cans. Far from the smoke of Normandy, another battle raged, a silent, relentless war fought with blueprints, furnaces, and sweat. The outcome of that war would decide who ruled Europe long before any tank crossed a battlefield. In Germany, tank production resembled a cathedral of craftsmanship. At the Henschel plant in Kassel, engineers moved like surgeons around the half-assembled bodies of Tigers. Master welders inspected every seam with magnifiers. Machinists measured gears to fractions of a millimeter. Each engine was hand-tuned, each transmission hand-fitted. Every Tiger that rolled out of the factory carried the invisible signatures of hundreds of skilled men who treated it as a work of art. But art takes time. One Tiger consumed the labor of 9,000 workers for a month. It devoured rare metals, high-grade steel, and scarce fuel before it even left the factory gate. The German workforce prided itself on precision, but precision had become a trap. Each tank was unique. Parts were not fully interchangeable. Small differences in machining meant repairs required craftsmen, not soldiers. In an age when speed meant survival, the Tiger was a slow-beating heart inside a dying empire. Across the Atlantic, Detroit's skyline burned bright with the fire of mass production. The Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal covered more than 1 million square feet, larger than all of Germany's tank plants combined. Where German factories echoed with the measured rhythm of hammers, Detroit roared with the thunder of assembly lines. Everything moved, everything repeated. A tank started as steel plates at one end and rolled out fully painted at the other in 48 hours. There was no room for perfection here, only process. The workforce was an army of the ordinary: automobile workers, farmers, housewives, immigrants, even high school kids who had never seen a tank before. They didn't need to understand the whole machine, only their step in the sequence. One woman welded the same seam thousands of times a week. Another tightened the same bolts for 12 hours straight. Together, they created momentum that no enemy could stop. Rosie the Riveter became their symbol, her rolled sleeves and steady eyes representing not glamour, but endurance. They gave me 2 days of training, one riveter recalled, then put me on the line. The tank moved, I did my weld, then it moved again. 4 hours later, another Sherman rolled away. By the end of 1942, 11 factories across America were producing Sherman tanks. Chrysler, Fisher Body, Pressed Steel, Baldwin Locomotive, Pullman, Montreal Locomotive, each a cog in a national machine. Together, they produced 3,500 tanks per month. Germany built 34 Tigers. The ratio, 100-1, was not a number anymore. It was a forecast of destiny. Industrial America had turned war into a science of repetition. Engineers simplified everything: bolts, fuel systems, suspension arms. Parts from one factory fit any Sherman from another. Tanks were no longer individual machines. They were standardized organisms. This interchangeability allowed maintenance crews to rebuild wrecks in hours and production lines to run without pause. In Germany, the opposite was true. Allied bombers struck Kassel again and again, forcing the plant to shut down for weeks. Skilled machinists were drafted into the army, replaced by forced laborers who neither cared nor understood their work. Quality dropped, output fell, and every damaged Tiger demanded a journey back to the homeland for proper repair. The war that had begun with confidence in German genius now crawled under the weight of its own complexity. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the night never came. The tank arsenal glowed 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Christmas and New Year's were just dates painted on the factory calendar. Workers arrived in the snow with thermoses of coffee and left beneath dawn light. "Every tank we build is a life saved," read the banner above the assembly line. They believed it. Many had brothers and husbands fighting in those very tanks across the ocean. A Polish immigrant named Mary Krivsky worked 16-hour shifts welding armor plates. "My brother was in Italy," she said later. "Every Sherman I built, I imagined him inside. That's why I never complained." Absenteeism at the Detroit arsenal remained below 2%. In Germany, it soared above 15 as air raids, hunger, and despair spread. Hitler's speeches could not motivate a starving workforce. America's quiet determination, born of family and duty, did what propaganda never could. It kept the line moving. The difference was moral as much as mechanical. In Detroit, workers volunteered for overtime. In Kassel, laborers worked under threat. In the United States, factories were symbols of freedom. In Germany, they became prisons. One system rewarded pride, the other enforced obedience. Only one could last. When German inspectors visited the Henschel plant in late 1944, they found the numbers terrifying. Kassel factory produces 8 Tigers this month, one report read. Americans produce this many in 4 hours. It was not exaggeration. The United States had reached a tempo of production so high that generals began measuring progress in hours, not days. While German engineers refined blueprints for the perfect tank, American mechanics built replacements for the ones already destroyed. Every improvement Germany added to its Tigers, thicker armor, heavier guns, complex optics, made them slower to build, harder to fix, and hungrier for fuel. The more perfect they became, the less practical they were. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, would later confess, "We sought perfection and achieved paralysis." In the vast warehouses of Allied supply depots, crates of Sherman parts stacked higher than men. Engines, turrets, transmissions, treads, all waiting, all interchangeable. Logistics officers joked that if an American tank crew needed a new part, they could simply open the next boxcar. If a Tiger crew needed one, they might wait a month, if the trains still ran. By early 1944, production was no longer just a military advantage. It was a psychological weapon. German prisoners taken in Normandy were shown the endless lines of Shermans waiting in British ports. Many lowered their heads in disbelief. One veteran later wrote, "They told us each Tiger was worth 10 of theirs. Then we saw hundreds. We knew arithmetic had already decided. In this new kind of war, the factory had replaced the fortress. Victory no longer depended on courage or even tactics, but on which nation could turn steel and sweat into momentum." The Tiger may have been a masterpiece, but the Sherman was a movement. And movements, once set in motion, do not stop. By the autumn of 1944, the Tiger was still feared, but its roar had grown faint, not because the gun had dulled, but because the tanks could no longer move. The battlefield was not won or lost by armor thickness or barrel length. It was decided by fuel, by maintenance, and by the invisible arteries of supply that kept armies alive. In those arteries, Germany was bleeding out. A Tiger consumed fuel like a living furnace, 5 gallons for every mile across open ground. Its Maybach engine demanded premium gasoline, at least 87 octane, the kind Germany could barely produce by then. Each heavy battalion required 40,000 gallons of fuel to move 100 miles, but by mid-1944, German refineries were in ruins. Allied bombers had pounded the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pulitz into twisted metal. Trains carrying gasoline ran only at night, hunted by fighter bombers that stalked the rails. Whole tank companies waited in forests, engines silent, crews staring at empty jerry cans. In contrast, the Americans swam in oil. From Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana came an unending river of gasoline. It crossed the Atlantic in convoys of tankers and flowed through the Red Ball Express, a ceaseless chain of 6,000 trucks thundering from Normandy's beaches to the front lines. Day and night, through mud and artillery fire, they delivered everything: ammunition, spare parts, rations, and above all, fuel. On August 29, 1944 alone, the Red Ball Express carried 12,000 tons of supplies and 800,000 gallons of gasoline. German officers watched the endless convoys with disbelief. "They come like ants," one wrote. "We destroy dozens of vehicles, and by nightfall more arrive." Each gallon of Allied fuel was a bullet aimed at German industry. The Tiger's other enemy was itself. Its complex systems demanded constant attention. A single broken track pin could immobilize 68 tons of steel. Mud and ice froze between the interleaved wheels, locking them solid. Mechanics spent nights hammering with crowbars just to move again. Replacing a transmission required lifting the turret with a crane that often didn't exist. A Tiger needed 10 hours of maintenance for every hour it fought. Shermans, by comparison, were forgiving machines. They burned ordinary fuel, even aviation gas if needed. They could run with leaking seals, dented armor, or mismatched tracks. Replacing a part was as simple as unbolting it. Their suspension was crude but resilient, and their engines, derived from truck designs, rarely failed completely. If it moved, it fought, joked one American mechanic. The difference became visible in statistics. American tank divisions maintained 90% operational readiness, even after weeks of combat. German heavy tank units struggled to keep 20% of their Tigers running. Field reports told the same story. In August 1944, Hauptmann Wolfgang Schlick of Heavy Tank Battalion 506 wrote, "We have 6 operational Tigers but fuel for 30 kilometers. We watch the American columns pass our position in endless lines. We dare not attack. We would destroy 20 and then sit helpless as 200 crushed us." To the men who fought inside them, the Tiger was both miracle and curse. Its armor could deflect nearly any Allied shell. Its gun could punch through a Sherman from 2,000 meters. Yet the men who commanded it knew its weaknesses too well. Each mechanical groan, each flicker of the fuel gauge carried dread. The Tiger demanded perfection from its crew, perfect maintenance, perfect fuel, perfect timing. War allows none of those. When fuel did arrive, it often came too late. German convoys moved under constant threat from airstrikes. A single P-47 Thunderbolt could wipe out a day's supply with one strafing run. Many Tiger units abandoned their vehicles not because they were hit, but because their tanks were thirsty beyond rescue. Photographs from the retreat across France showed dozens of Tigers left by the roadside. Engines intact, barrels clean, but fuel tanks dry. In those same days, American engineers perfected a different kind of warfare. Repair. Mobile workshops followed the front lines equipped with cranes, spare engines, and welding tools. A damaged Sherman could be towed, patched, and returned to battle within 24 hours. Some divisions reported reusing the same tank 3 times in a single week. Captain Thomas Roberts of the 16th Armored Recovery Battalion described it simply: "We'd pick up a Sherman that caught fire in the morning, haul it back by noon, patch it up by nightfall, and send it out again the next morning. The Germans would mark it as destroyed, then face it again 3 days later." The war had become a cycle: destruction and resurrection. For Germany, each destroyed Tiger was a permanent loss. For America, each wrecked Sherman was a temporary setback. In this endless loop of consumption and renewal, arithmetic became destiny. Every Tiger destroyed subtracted irreplaceable experience. Its crew, its craftsmanship, its fuel, its tools. Every Sherman destroyed added momentum. New production orders, new jobs, new confidence. The United States was learning that victory did not belong to those who built the best machines, but to those who could keep them moving. By late 1944, even Hitler's most loyal commanders began to see the futility. "We are fighting against factories, not men," wrote Major Friedrich Müller after visiting a bombed-out assembly hall in Kassel. "Every Tiger we lose takes a month to replace. Every Sherman they lose takes a day." The Tiger, once a symbol of German might, had become a monument to exhaustion. It was too powerful for the world that birthed it, too heavy, too thirsty, too complex to survive in a war that rewarded speed and simplicity. Meanwhile, the Sherman kept rolling. Across muddy fields, through ruined villages, up mountains, and down into valleys, its engines hummed. Not elegant, not perfect, but endless. Each one a small piece of a greater machine called America, And behind that machine stood millions of hands, tightening bolts, pouring fuel, loading trucks. In their rhythm lay the quiet truth that would define the century. Power no longer came from genius alone, but from production, the simple act of making more, faster, and together. The immortal Tiger could command a battlefield, but it could not command time, nor numbers, nor the tide of a world that had learned how to build without stopping. Winter, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay frozen beneath a pale sky. Snow muffled the sound of engines, but not the echoes of desperation. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's final gamble, had begun. It was meant to split the Allied line, to seize Antwerp, to turn back time. For this last great offensive, Germany gathered its most precious beasts. 450 tanks, including 69 of the mighty King Tigers, the heaviest and most feared tanks in existence. Each one was a fortress on tracks, armed with an even deadlier version of the 88mm gun. They were the pride of the Reich, the culmination of all its engineering brilliance. But as they rumbled into the snow, they carried within them the seeds of their own extinction. The Ardennes offensive was not a battle of tactics, it was a test of logistics. The King Tiger consumed fuel like a drowning man gasping for air. It needed 1,500 liters to move 100 kilometers. Germany had enough to move them 60. The rest, Hitler promised, they would capture from the Americans. But how does one steal fuel from an enemy who never runs out? Within days, German armored columns began to stall. At first, engines sputtered, then froze. By the third week, entire units were stranded. Tiger crews drained fuel from disabled tanks just to keep a few moving. Joachim Peiper's famed battle group advanced brilliantly until the fuel drums ran dry. The King Tigers that had terrified Allied tankers now stood silent on the roadside, their crews setting charges to destroy them. Flames rose from the snow as the invincible weapons of the Reich became burning monuments to failure. Meanwhile, the American response was not elegant, but it was immediate. General George Patton's Third Army swung north like a door on oiled hinges. In 48 hours, he moved 350 Shermans into position. They lost 88 tanks in 2 days, but by the end of that same week, replacements had arrived. American depots measured their strength not in divisions, but in reserves. Each destroyed tank was simply a line crossed off a ledger, already rewritten by Detroit. A German officer watching through binoculars confessed in his diary, "We fought with brilliance. They fought with abundance. Brilliance runs out." The collapse of perfection was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. From the very beginning, Hitler's Germany had believed in the supremacy of the exceptional. Every tank, every airplane, every rifle was designed as a masterpiece, finely tuned, overbuilt, and individualized. But perfection, by its nature, resists multiplication. Each improvement delayed production. Each modification demanded new tools, new adjustments, new labor. The more perfect the Tiger became, the fewer Tigers existed. America's factories, by contrast, worshipped standardization. The Sherman was not perfect, but it was enough. Its simplicity allowed speed, its flaws invited adaptation. As the war evolved, the Sherman evolved with it. Upgraded guns, thicker armor, rocket launchers, bulldozer blades, amphibious skirts. The Tiger aged like a monument. The Sherman aged like a species, constantly mutating to survive. When the two philosophies met on the battlefield, the result was inevitable. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman at 2 kilometers, but for every Tiger, there were 10 Shermans. When the first burned, the second advanced. When the second fell, the third maneuvered. And above them, the air filled with thunderbolts and typhoons that turned even the thickest armor into molten steel. In Cologne, March 1945, A lone Panther tank faced an advancing column of Shermans. The gun duel was brief, cinematic even, captured by a combat cameraman hiding in the ruins. One precise American shot pierced the Panther's turret, ending the fight. The film would later become one of the most famous clips of the war, but what the camera didn't show was the rest of the square. 11 Shermans lay wrecked around the cathedral. Within 24 hours, 15 new ones rolled into place. The Germans had run out of machines to film. To the men who built the Tigers, the defeat was incomprehensible. How could excellence lose to mediocrity? Albert Speer, reflecting years later, wrote, "We sought perfection and achieved paralysis. Every modification delayed production, every improvement diminished quantity. Meanwhile, the Americans built the same imperfect tank by the tens of thousands, and won." That was the quiet revolution of the 20th century. The workshop yielded to the assembly line. The craftsman's pride was no longer the measure of power. Output was. The ability to produce, replace, and sustain became the new definition of strength. By 1945, the cost of perfection was measured in exhaustion. German factories were shells. Their skilled workers were dead or drafted. Bombs fell day and night. Power flickered. Materials vanished. Forced laborers worked under guards, their sabotage adding invisible cracks to every weld. The Tigers that emerged were ghosts of their predecessors. Beautiful, flawed, doomed. At the same time, across the ocean, the Detroit tank arsenal reached a rhythm that bordered on the divine. 48 hours for a complete tank. 2 shifts replaced every casualty. Even the smallest innovation saved lives. A woman at Press Steel discovered that reversing a weld sequence saved 4 minutes per tank. Implemented nationwide, it created enough spare hours each month to build 40 more tanks. Every improvement, no matter how small, multiplied exponentially. Germany refined, America iterated. By March 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. On the Western Front, fewer than 20 operational Tigers remained. Across Europe, 35,000 Shermans were on the move. The Tiger could no longer be everywhere. The Sherman was everywhere at once. Friedrich von Mellenthin, one of Germany's most respected Panzer generals, summarized it without bitterness. "We built 1,347 Tigers. They built 49,134 Shermans. Everything else is commentary." The Tiger's shadow stretched long over history. Even today, it sits in museums, revered as the greatest tank ever made. Its engineering brilliance still inspires awe. But in the frozen forests of 1944, that brilliance could not move without gasoline. It could not fight without parts. It could not exist without a nation capable of sustaining it. The Tiger was the peak of craftsmanship and the tombstone of a philosophy. Meanwhile, the Sherman became something else entirely, not a legend, but a legacy. It was proof that ordinary machines made by ordinary people could change the course of history when built with purpose and unity. The Tiger was the best. The Sherman was the winner. And in the end, war did not honor perfection. It honored persistence. Spring 1945. The thunder of tank tracks still echoed across Europe, but it was no longer the sound of battle. It was the rhythm of inevitability. Germany was collapsing, city by city, factory by factory. The empire that once built the most advanced machines in the world had become a scrapyard of broken steel. The Tiger tanks that had terrified Allied soldiers 2 years earlier now sat abandoned along the autobahns, their turrets turned toward the sky, their fuel tanks dry. They had not been destroyed in combat. They had simply run out of everything that kept them alive: fuel, parts, and time. In contrast, the roads behind the advancing Allied lines were alive with motion. Convoys stretched beyond the horizon, fuel trucks, spare parts, recovery vehicles, mobile forges, mechanics, cooks, doctors, all moving in rhythm, like blood through the veins of an invincible organism. Each tank, each jeep, each truck was a cell in something greater, the industrial body of the United States. In January 1945, Germany could muster fewer than 800 operational tanks on all fronts combined. The United States alone had more than 20,000 in Europe, and another 6,000 waiting in depots or training grounds back home. Production had become a weapon sharper than any gun. While German engineers struggled to complete a handful of Tigers under bombing raids, American factories were preparing the next generation, the Pershing tanks, rolling off the lines even before the war ended. The final battles were no longer contests of strategy. They were mathematical conclusions. Each German division that tried to resist was crushed beneath the avalanche of production that had begun years earlier in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. Each Tiger that fired its last shell represented a beautiful but doomed idea that perfection could outlast abundance. At Henschel's factory in Kassel, inspectors wrote their last report in March 1945. Armor plating exhausted, transmission supplies destroyed, skilled workers drafted, slave labor unreliable, monthly output 0. Bombing raids had turned the once proud plant into rubble. What had been a cathedral of engineering now stood silent under the smoke of defeat. Meanwhile, in Michigan, workers at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal were still clocking in for the night shift. They did not yet know the war was almost over. The conveyor belts kept moving, the welders kept sparking, the riveters kept pounding. Production did not slow down because production was no longer about war. It had become a habit, a heartbeat, a national rhythm that no one wanted to stop. To the Americans, the Sherman was never sacred. It was a tool, a means to an end. If one burned, 10 more would follow. That simple truth reshaped how wars were fought and how nations survived. In the ruins of Cologne, a German officer stood beside the wreckage of his Tiger. The massive tank lay half buried in rubble, its gun still pointing toward the river. "We lost," he said quietly to a captured Allied reporter, "not to soldiers, but to factories." His words would echo through every nation that watched Germany fall. The arithmetic was merciless. A Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman required 40,000. Every Tiger that rolled off the assembly line cost 6 to 7 Shermans. Every Tiger that broke down consumed parts that took months to replace. Every Tiger crew lost erased a year of training. By the end, the Wehrmacht was cannibalizing its own tanks just to keep a few running. American tank battalions, on the other hand, reported 90% operational readiness even during combat. If a Sherman broke down, it was stripped, repaired, or replaced within days. If a Tiger broke down, it became a monument of wasted steel. The Germans had designed a machine so advanced that their own system could no longer sustain it. The Americans had designed a machine so simple that anyone could keep it alive. That difference, more than any battle or bomb, decided the war. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the numbers told a story no propaganda could hide. Tigers produced 1,347, Shermans produced 49,234. Tigers operational at surrender, fewer than 20. Shermans operational worldwide, over 35,000. The ratio, 27 to 1, was not just a measure of output. It was the difference between dictatorship and democracy, between scarcity and abundance, between collapse and continuity. In the months that followed, Allied officers toured the wrecked factories of the Reich. They found half-finished Tigers rusting on assembly lines, engines missing, armor plates warped by bombing heat. They found design rooms filled with blueprints for perfect tanks that would never be built. And everywhere, they found the same lesson. Perfection was powerless without production. Across the ocean, American workers finally slowed their pace. The factories fell silent, but the echo of their labor lingered. The same assembly lines that had built Shermans would soon build tractors, cars, and machines for a world no longer at war. Industrial capacity had not just won a conflict, it had redefined civilization. At Fort Knox that summer, surviving tankers from both sides met for a joint reunion. They stood before two restored tanks, a Tiger Wine and an M4 Sherman. The German veterans circled their machine with reverence. "She was the best ever built," one said softly. The Americans nodded. "She was," another replied, "but ours won the war." Then, as silence filled the hall, a former Tiger commander, Otto Carius, stepped forward. He had destroyed more than 100 enemy tanks in his career. His voice was calm, almost weary. "We fought with excellence," he said. "You fought with arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins." That moment captured what generations of historians would later call the arithmetic of destiny. Germany had believed in brilliance. America believed in process. Brilliance can burn bright, but process endures. By 1945, the Tiger had become a myth, an immortal machine that could destroy anything it faced. Accept the simple truth that wars are not won by the best machines, but by the most sustainable ones. The Sherman was not the strongest nor the most beautiful, but it was enough, and enough multiplied by 49,000 is what victory looks like. Even today, visitors to military museums stop before the massive frame of a Tiger, awed by its size, its craftsmanship, its legend. Few notice the small, unassuming Sherman sitting beside it, paint faded, tracks worn. Yet it was that unremarkable machine, the so-called tin can, that buried the empire that built the Tiger. In the end, history remembers both. The Tiger as a masterpiece of engineering, the Sherman as a masterpiece of industry. One symbolized what man could create, the other what humanity could accomplish together. And between them lies the simple equation that ended the most destructive war in human history. 1,347 versus 49,034. Everything else was just commentary. May 1945. The guns fell silent, but the numbers still spoke. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to ash and its factories to twisted steel. The war had ended not only in surrender, but in revelation. For all its brilliance, for all its genius and precision, Germany had been defeated by a simpler truth, that the ability to build, to repair, and to replace faster than destruction could occur was the ultimate weapon. The Tiger had become a relic before it was ever truly conquered. In the months after surrender, Allied officers walked through the wreckage of German industry. In the ruins of the Henschel plant, they found unfinished Tiger hulls sitting beneath collapsed beams, their tracks rusted to the floor. Drawings of new supertanks lay scattered in the dust, machines larger, heavier, and even more impossible to build. To the engineers who once served the Reich, these blueprints were masterpieces. To the victors, they were monuments to a fatal obsession. Albert Speer, the man who had overseen German armament, sat in prison and wrote his confession. "We sought perfection and achieved paralysis. We measured progress by precision, not by speed. Every improvement slowed us. Every refinement delayed victory. We mistook craftsmanship for strength." Across the Atlantic, the factories that had forged the Sherman shifted without pause to a different kind of war. The war of reconstruction. Assembly lines that had once turned out tanks now produced tractors, cars, and farm equipment. The same women who had welded armor now riveted airplane frames for commercial flight. The same forges that had built cannon barrels now shaped steel for bridges and locomotives. The rhythm of production, once driven by survival, had become the heartbeat of peace. It was not just the United States that learned. The Soviet Union, watching closely, understood that industrial volume was its shield in the coming Cold War. The lessons of the Sherman became the blueprint for the T-54 and T-55, tanks that would number more than 100,000 in the decades to come. They were not beautiful, they were not perfect, but they were enough. And in Germany, after years of reflection and ruin, a quiet transformation began. The nation that once believed in flawless singularity began to rediscover the power of practicality. When West Germany eventually returned to tank design, it no longer chased the ghost of the Tiger. It pursued balance, efficiency, reliability, maintainability. The result was the Leopard series, machines admired not for excess, but for precision guided by restraint. They were not monuments to pride, but instruments of defense. The ghosts of 1944 still lingered in every bolt. The lesson had seeped deeper than steel. It reached into culture, into identity, into how nations understood the relationship between creation and survival. The Tiger was born of ego, the belief that mastery of craft alone could conquer. The Sherman was born of humility, the understanding that collective effort could outweigh individual genius. Both represented humanity, but in opposite ways. One celebrated the mind, the other the mass. Decades later, when veterans from both sides met again, they spoke not as enemies, but as witnesses to an era that had taught them something cruelly simple. Otto Carius, the Tiger ace who had destroyed more than 100 Allied tanks, said softly, "We believed we could engineer victory. They engineered endurance." At the same reunion, an American tanker named Wardell Henderson smiled as he looked at the same Tiger he had once feared. "I never wanted to face that thing one-on-one," he admitted, "but we never fought one-on-one. We fought with numbers, with support, with supplies. We didn't need to be heroes. We just had to keep moving forward." Those words carried more than pride. They carried philosophy. Because the true battlefield of the 20th century was not between tanks or armies, but between two ideas: perfection and persistence. Perfection isolates. It creates few, demands much, and punishes failure. Persistence multiplies. It accepts imperfection, adapts, and survives. The Tiger was a monument to perfection. The Sherman was a hymn to persistence. In the decades that followed, this divide shaped the modern world. The post-war economies that thrived, Japan, West Germany, the United States, all embraced the arithmetic of iteration. Produce, improve, produce again. In factories, offices, and laboratories, the lesson of the Sherman lived on. Make it simple, make it fast, make it fixable. Even today, historians debate which tank was better. They measure armor thickness, gun velocity, kill ratios. But the truth has long escaped those numbers. The Tiger was superior in every technical sense, yet it was doomed by its own excellence. The Sherman was inferior in design, yet elevated by the system that created it. The winner was never the tank. It was the philosophy that powered it. Visitors who stand in the museum at Fort Knox can see them side by side. The Tiger sits majestic, huge, its surfaces glinting under the lights. The Sherman beside it looks plain, almost humble. Yet on the plaque beneath them, a single line summarizes the war better than any statistic. Tiger 1-347 built. Sherman M4 49-234 built. The Tiger dominated battlefields. The Sherman liberated continents. That is the final equation of the war. Not a story of destruction, but of understanding. Not about who built the strongest, but about who built the most enduring. Because history, like war, does not reward beauty. It rewards balance. The Tiger remains the symbol of what humanity can design. The Sherman remains the proof of what humanity can achieve together. And between those two machines, between the roar of a masterpiece and the hum of a production line, lies the greatest lesson the 20th century ever taught: that the destiny of nations is not decided by the brilliance of their inventions, but by the resilience of their systems and the will of their people to keep them moving. The war ended in silence, but the arithmetic lived on. The war ended, but the machines remained. Scattered across Europe, their carcasses slept beneath moss and mud, mute witnesses to the century's most brutal equation. Along forgotten roads, in French hedgerows and Polish forests, the rusting shells of tigers still rested where their engines had died, colossal monuments to ambition turned to dust. Children played around them in the 1950s, not knowing that beneath their feet lay the dreams of engineers who once believed perfection could defeat time. The Tiger was more than a tank. It was an idea made of iron, the belief that excellence alone could dominate the world. But as decades passed, that belief grew quiet, buried under the same soil that swallowed empires. When historians and restorers began to salvage what remained, they found not just steel, but sorrow. 7 Tigers survived intact, 7 ghosts from an army of 1,347. Each one required years of work to awaken again. The engines roared once more in museums, their sound no longer menacing, but mournful. In one of those museums, the Tank Museum at Bovington in England, the last running Tiger, number 131, still breathes. Its thick plates gleam under the soft light, and its massive tracks clatter across the concrete floor during demonstrations. Visitors stand in awe, phones raised, hearts racing at the sound of that ancient growl. But among the crowd, veterans sometimes fall silent. They do not see a monster, they see memory, a relic of a world where brilliance became a burden, where machines demanded everything from the men who drove them. Across the ocean, in quiet American towns, Shermans still move, not in battle, but in parades. Their engines hum like steady heartbeats, simple, familiar, human. Some sit in parks painted olive green, flowers growing from their tracks. Others serve as teaching tools for soldiers who never knew a world without abundance. Unlike the Tigers, the Shermans were never rare. Thousands survived, scattered across continents, reminders that greatness sometimes comes not from uniqueness, but from ubiquity. Time transformed both machines. The Tiger became legend. The Sherman became legacy. The Tiger inspired books, films, and debates, an icon of German engineering, both admired and cursed. The Sherman inspired gratitude. It was not glamorous, but it carried men home. To its crews, it was more than metal. It was a lifeline, a promise that if it failed, another would be waiting. In that contrast lies a truth deeper than war. The Tiger represents what humans can create when they chase perfection. The Sherman represents what they can accomplish when they choose cooperation. The Tiger stood for the individual genius, the craftsman who works alone, shaping every piece until flawless. The Sherman stood for the collective, the workers on assembly lines, the riveters, the drivers, the mechanics, the millions who believed their small acts mattered because they were part of something greater. When a Tiger broke, its crew fought to the end because they had no replacement. When a Sherman broke, its crew bailed out, walked back, and returned in another. One philosophy valued the machine above the man. The other valued the man above the machine. That is why, in the long memory of history, the Tiger will always command respect, but the Sherman will command affection. In 1989, on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, an elderly German veteran named Friedrich Schultz stood among American, British, and Canadian soldiers for the 45th anniversary of D-Day. He had commanded a Tiger near Caen and lost his entire crew. Now, gray-haired and trembling, he faced the sea once more. The ceremony ended, and silence settled over the rows of white crosses. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke quietly. "We came with the best machines the world had ever seen, and we believed that made us invincible. You came with machines that were merely good, but there were so many of them. We fought with excellence. You fought with arithmetic. In the end, arithmetic always wins." Those who heard him never forgot the words. Because beneath the statistics and the steel, the war had always been about something more profound, the fate of human belief. The Tiger was faith in genius, The Sherman was faith in people. Today, when the Tiger's engine rumbles at Bovington, it shakes the air with its power. But when a Sherman drives through a small-town parade, children climb aboard, waving flags, laughing. One carries the echo of fear. The other carries the echo of endurance. Both are ghosts now, haunting reminders that the 20th century's greatest weapon was not the gun, nor the tank, but the system capable of building them faster than they could be destroyed. Inside every museum, between the smell of oil and rust, visitors see their reflections on the armor plates. Some marvel at the engineering. Others whisper to themselves about the lives those machines once carried. And somewhere, deep inside that reflection lies the question that still matters. Would you rather build the perfect machine, or build a world that can survive without one? The Tiger answers with silence. The Sherman answers with motion. And so, long after the fire of war faded, the arithmetic remains carved into history. Germany built 1,347 Tigers. America rolled out 49,534 Shermans. Everything else, the glory, the tragedy, the debate, is only commentary. Decades after the war, the world began to count differently. It no longer measured power in guns or armor, but in something quieter, in how many lives could be built instead of destroyed, how many people could be fed instead of armed. Yet the echoes of the Tiger and the Sherman lingered, not as relics of machines, but as metaphors for two opposing instincts within the human heart: the desire to perfect and the need to persist. Every civilization wrestles with this choice. Perfection is seductive. It promises beauty, control, immortality. It whispers that one flawless thing can redeem the chaos of the world. But history has shown that perfection demands sacrifice, of time, of energy, of people. It isolates brilliance and makes it fragile. The Tiger was that temptation made steel. Each one demanded thousands of hours of labor, rare materials, and irreplaceable expertise. Each one was a masterpiece born into a world that no longer had the luxury of masterpieces. Persistence, on the other hand, is humble. It asks less of each person but more of everyone. It thrives not on genius, but on cooperation. It builds slowly, imperfectly, but endlessly. The Sherman was not a symbol of excellence. It was a symbol of endurance, the ability to keep moving when perfection fails. It was a reflection of democracy itself, messy, flawed, and unstoppable when united. That contrast between the Tiger and the Sherman, between perfection and persistence, became the blueprint for the modern age. The Cold War, the space race, the information era, all echoed that same lesson. The nations that thrived were not those that made the most exquisite machines, but those that could produce and sustain them in vast numbers, that could teach ordinary people to build extraordinary things. It is easy to romanticize the Tiger, to admire its thick armor, its elegant engineering, its tragic grandeur. It was a lion trapped in a world of wolves, majestic, doomed, magnificent in its failure. But every time its tracks sank into the mud, it carried the weight of a flawed belief that genius could replace cooperation, that one brilliant machine could outthink an entire society of workers. The Sherman, on the other hand, was not beautiful. It was plain, boxy, noisy. It rattled when it moved and groaned when it fired, but it represented something far greater than itself. An army of anonymous people, each tightening one bolt, welding one seam, filling one shell, driving one truck. They never saw the front lines. They never heard the thunder of artillery, but their collective rhythm shaped the sound of victory. In Detroit, at the same factories where Shermans once rolled, workers later built the machines of peace. Tractors, cars, engines for farms and hospitals. The same hands that welded armor for war would weld pipelines for water and girders for schools. The same women who riveted steel for tanks would raise children who became engineers and teachers. The same factories that produced destruction would later build prosperity. That is the true arithmetic of humanity, the transformation of force into foundation, of power into progress. Historians often debate whether war drives innovation. But the truth is simpler. It is not war that creates progress. It is pressure. And pressure reveals what societies value most. Germany, in its twilight, valued perfection. America, at its peak, valued production. One dream burned bright and short, the other burned steady and long. When a Tiger was lost, it took months to replace. When a Sherman was lost, it was replaced by mourning. The Tiger's crews fought for survival. Sherman's crews fought for continuity. In that difference lay the quiet triumph of human pragmatism over pride. Otto Carius once reflected in an interview late in life. The Tiger was the best tank ever built, but it was a weapon for another kind of war, one we could no longer afford to fight. His words captured what his generation had learned the hard way, that technology without scalability, brilliance without sustainability, is a candle against a storm. If you stand today in Bovington in front of Tiger 131 and place your hand on its cold armor, you can still feel its weight, not just in metal, but in meaning. It is the weight of human ambition, magnificent and flawed. If you walk to the Sherman sitting nearby, chipped and faded, you'll feel something else. A quiet pulse, the echo of motion that never stopped. The Tiger reminds us of what humans can create when they chase greatness alone. The Sherman reminds us of what they can preserve when they work together. And perhaps that is why the Sherman, not the Tiger, became the ancestor of modern progress. The spirit of the Tiger built marvels. The spirit of the Sherman built systems. And systems, organized, adaptable, human, are what hold civilization together long after the last shot is fired. When historians sum up the war, they speak of strategy and courage, of generals and battles, but between the lines, a deeper truth remains. The nations that survive are not those that build the best machines, but those that build the strongest people. Because the arithmetic of war ends in numbers. The arithmetic of humanity begins in hearts. The Tiger's roar has faded. The Sherman's engines are silent. Yet their story endures, not as a tale of who won or lost, but as a mirror held up to the human condition. In every age, in every nation, we will face the same choice again, to build something perfect, or to build something that lasts. And somewhere, beneath the rust and the silence, the answer still whispers, through the ghosts of steel, through the hum of old engines, through the arithmetic that outlived the war. The museum is quiet now. The scent of oil and dust lingers in the air, mingled with the faint metallic echo of footsteps on the concrete floor. There, under the soft museum lights, the two machines stand side by side. The Tiger, monumental and proud, looms like an ancient statue carved from steel. The Sherman, smaller, humbler, sits beside it, its green paint faded, its edges worn smooth by decades of touch. Children press their palms against its armor, tracing the scratches, whispering questions their parents cannot answer. And in that silence, the two tanks, once enemies, share the same peace that their builders never knew. The Tiger's surfaces gleam under the light, every bolt a reminder of human obsession. It is perfect, and that is its tragedy. It was born from a nation that believed excellence could replace empathy, that precision could conquer scale, that genius could defy arithmetic. But perfection, like pride, is heavy. It cannot move easily. It does not bend. It breaks. The Sherman, by contrast, wears its history like a workman's glove, scarred, stained, enduring. It was not made to impress, only to function. It was built for men who would not be remembered, by hands that never saw the front lines. Yet those anonymous hands changed the world. Each rivet, each weld, each gallon of fuel carried within it a quiet declaration. That ordinary people, when united by purpose, can overcome anything, even the most perfect machine ever built. A placard stands between them now. Its words are simple. Tiger, Orksen in Lawn 347 produced. Sherman M4, 49,234 produced. Below that, a single sentence. Wars are not won by the best machines, but by the people who can keep them running. Visitors pause. Some take pictures. Some simply stare. But the few who linger longer can almost hear it, the faint heartbeat beneath the silence, the whisper of gears turning in memory. The Tiger speaks of genius and glory. The Sherman speaks of endurance and grace. Together, they tell the story of a century. Outside, the sunlight drifts through clouds. In that light, everything loses its color distinctions of green and gray and becomes the same dull silver of time. Grass grows between the old tracks displayed along the path. Pigeons nest in the gaps of old armor. Nature, indifferent and patient, reclaims what man once used to define his power. But memory is not erased. It transforms. In the minds of those who remember, the Tiger and the Sherman are no longer weapons. They are teachers. The Tiger reminds us of the cost of perfection, of how brilliance without compassion leads to exhaustion. The Sherman reminds us that strength lies not in the one who shines brightest, but in the many who endure together. Decades after the war, the arithmetic still holds. 1,347 Tigers, 49,234 Shermans. Those numbers, repeated in textbooks and documentaries, are more than statistics. They are the coordinates of a moral lesson carved into the 20th century. That power built for domination will collapse under its own weight, and power built for continuity will carry humanity forward. At Bovington, during one of the annual Tank Fest parades, Tiger 131 roars to life. The crowd gasps as its engine growls, a thunderous sound both ancient and alive. Children cover their ears. Veterans close their eyes. Some cry. Across the field, a Sherman starts its engine. Its tone is higher, gentler, less commanding, but it runs steady, smooth, reliable. When the two machines move together, the noise becomes something more than sound. It becomes remembrance. For a brief moment, they are no longer enemies. They are echoes, one of ambition, the other of endurance. Together, they remind us what war can take and what wisdom it can leave behind. And when the engines fade and silence returns, the lesson remains suspended in the air. Perfection made the Tiger eternal in memory. Persistence made the Sherman eternal in history. In every generation, we face the same question those factories once answered. Will we build things to be admired, or things to endure? Will we chase brilliance for ourselves, or create systems that survive without us? The Tiger answers through its stillness, a masterpiece that could not move fast enough to survive. The Sherman answers through its absence, its parts scattered, its form replicated, its purpose fulfilled. They were both born of fire, forged by fear and guided by faith in human creation. But only one carried the weight of humanity forward, not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. That is the mathematics of memory, that the greatness of a civilization is not measured by what it builds to destroy, but by what it builds to last. And so the story ends where it began, in the quiet after the thunder, among the ghosts of steel. The Tiger stands still. The Sherman rests beside it. Between them lies the sum of everything the 20th century learned about war, about industry, about people. Perfection fades. Persistence remains. And in that persistence, humanity endures.